есть город, который я вижу во сне. О, если бы знали, как дорог у Черного моря открывшийся мне в цветущих акациях город, в цветущих акациях город у Черного моря.
But I wanted to thank Ala and Carol for inviting me. It's been a fascinating few days, and I've also met some wonderful women, which is terrific. But there have been also some good men here. So, there was a New York Times headline, small headline, a few days ago, several days ago. It said was a powerful woman but not a feminist, and it was about Merkel. And Merkel, of course, is not a revolutionary, but this whole title did bring to mind a number of topics that I think have been relevant in our discussions, and a lot of questions that I've been asking myself quite often. For example, what is the relationship between women and peace or war or pacifism, between feminism and pacifism, or these two ideologies, feminism, pacifism, and revolution. And of course, there are a lot of things that are revolutionary. We can define revolution in many different ways, including social revolution and national liberation struggles and so on. And feminism itself, of course, is revolutionary. And then I had some sub-questions. The issue of the use of force or violence, militarism, nationalism, universalism, Marxism, socialism, liberalism, capitalism. I'm not going to talk about all of those things, but these are all things that came to mind. And sort of, for me anyway, looking at what might be the connections between them or the absence of connections. And so also, by the way, what I'm going to suggest, in many cases, I'm going to be talking in generalizations, but I think that should be understood. Or in many cases, I'm really just asking questions. The first one I took up was universalism. Because in the late 19th century and the early 20th century, revolution and revolutionary fervor had a universalist flavor, had a very clear universalist flavor. Many, I think, even most of the women revolutionaries looked at universalism, abided by it. They wanted to do away with the state. They wanted to do away with nationalism, whether it was in the name of the universal working class or humanity in general. They thought this would make the world a better place. Anarchists like Emma Goldman and Marxists like Rosa Luxemburg and most of the revolutionary women saw the state as an instrument of oppression, particularly, by the way, nation states. They saw the state as representing the interests of a particular group or nation or class, and by definition, a state was ruling by force or would lead to the use of force as a natural outcome of nationalism, for example. And nationalism itself was seen as divisive and oppressive. By the way, at the same time, many of these women supported self-determination for peoples living under colonial or imperial empires. So in the 20th century, of course, a lot of this took the form of anti-imperialism. But in Leninist terms, excuse me for using them, the idea was basically, okay, self-determination. First you meet your nationalist aspirations, and then you go on to universalism and freedom for everyone. So universalism in the first stage might take a back street. And national liberation became a revolutionary call and a path, I think, for many women revolutionaries. But then I look at the issue of pacifism, because many of those who espoused, many of these revolutionaries who clearly espoused universalism, opposed the state, opposed nationalism, were pacifists. Women who came to The Hague, for example, to oppose World War I, and they created the Women's Peace Party. They spoke in the name of universalism, but they spoke in the name of universalism as a means of bringing a different approach to resolving conflict. They argued for mediation. They argued for negotiation. In other words, against violence, in favor of pacifism, so as to prevent war and to oppose the war that was coming. But they connected the universalism and pacifism to one thing, a basic premise, so to speak, and that was their identity as women, and even more specifically, a link to motherhood, the maternal motif that we've talked about. They argued that war was women's worst enemy because war brought men to the center of things, excluding women. It was an anti-militarist position for many of these early feminists. But that said, many feminists, and I would say, I think even most of these early feminists, were anti-war women. These are the women who created the Women's Peace Party, but they invoked the feminist argument against war, but rejected the motherhood motif. They opposed militarism from the point of view, they opposed this motherhood motif as the basis for their anti-militarist position. Because these women, the feminists who did use the mother motif, and when they went to The Hague and created the Women's Peace Party, they talked about women as the mother of the human race, as women give life, they're nurturers, a protector of life. We know these arguments. And so their argument was that when women envisaged war, they saw pain and grief. And they argued that men, when they thought of war, thought of power. When they spoke of war, they spoke of aggrandizement, of expansion. By the way, when I saw this, when I was reading this, this way of distinguishing between men's view of war and women's view of war, I was reminded of something that Hannah Arendt wrote, where she said that men and women define power differently, whereas men see, when they think of power, they're thinking of power over others, over something, control. Whereas women, when they speak of power, talk about power is a result of working together. And this is her distinction, not entirely like the earlier ones, but clearly a different perception of power and maybe even a different perception of war. And research that we did interviewing women and thought, what is your first reaction when you hear the word war? I must admit that the responses we found were indeed pain, wounds, injuries, death, which was not the way the first thoughts of men. The first thoughts of men were weapons systems and strategies and so forth. But to get back to the feminist, pacifist, and anti-militarist argument, those who rejected the motherhood motif did so because of, we've talked about here too, because it tended to reinforce the traditional view of women. But for many feminists, war not only put men in the center, elevating their importance, it reinforced men's sense of entitlement, their special role in society. And it also placed male values and norms and customs into the center of things. Because if we stop to look at it, the military, the army, is a quintessence of patriarchy, based on hierarchy, on orders, on commands, indeed on power over. And it also, of course, if we look at the military, the patriarchal institution, of course it also glorifies, or at least places aggressiveness or strength in the center. So, in fact, there were differences, and in some cases differences between the feminists and the pacifists in their anti-militarism and the different arguments that they used. But I think most of these feminist revolutionaries most rejected the motherhood motif. But there were other differences amongst the revolutionary women. Some of them, like Rosa Luxemburg, were concerned for women, but rejected a separate entity, a feminist movement, or separate appeals, or separate demands. She wasn't alone, of course, in arguing that the women's revolution should be part of the whole world revolution, that world revolution would free everyone. And for Marxists like Rosa Luxemburg, equality for women would come with general equality through the working class, a proletarian revolution, of course. But speaking of equality, there were also those who equated equality and democracy. It was one and the same in their eyes. They connected this actually as a condition for peace, arguing that these were requirements if we were to have peace. I won't go into this, but there were many, many internal differences as well as linkages amongst these early women revolutionaries. But one thing I think can be said about them, about these early women revolutionaries, whether they were anarchists like Emma Goldman or socialist or Marxist like Rosa Luxemburg, they were for the most part pacifists and universalists, opposed to nationalism, opposed to war, but they also, all of them gave attention to women's rights, even if they differed on how these rights were to be achieved or what role women were to play in the struggle. But I want to leave these early revolutionaries and go on to another era and another group or type of women revolutionaries. And these are the women in the revolutionary movements, the national liberation movements of the 20th century and today, to see if there is linkage of any kind for these revolutionary women, linkage between their national struggle, peace, and women's rights. Of course, there are many differences and arguments even amongst women and men in national liberation movements over tactics, whether or not to use violence, the value or legitimacy of armed struggle as distinct from nonviolence. But we're also familiar, particularly recently, I think, with the connection between national liberation struggle and women's rights. It's almost a truism, the example that's given of the Algerian War, where women fought, struggled side by side with men in the national liberation struggle. After independence, they go back to the kitchen, so to speak. We know this, it's very common amongst these modern struggles and national liberation movements. Much like the feminists, by the way, the British feminists, suffragettes, who abandoned the women's struggle in favor of supporting patriotism in the war. And then after the war, of course, the promises given were forgotten and they were back to where they were before the war. So this is a phenomenon we are very familiar with in terms of national liberation movements. More recently, we see this in the DDR, and I don't mean the Democratic Republic of Germany, but DDR, that is disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration in peace building, post-conflict peace building. And what happens there, I've learned, is that we have women who were involved in their struggle, particularly in Africa, but not only. They were nurses, they were cooks, they did all kinds of things in the struggle, including fighting as well. But once we get to DDR, demobilization, disarmament, and reintegration, peace building, so to speak, post-conflict, the authorities, so to speak, international institutions, turn to the commanders. Okay, and who were the fighters? Who get the benefits, the various benefits that go along with demobilization and starting a new life? And the commanders never count the women. They never count the women. The women are not part of this handout. They don't get the benefits. And worse than that, not only do the commanders not count them, but in many cases when the women return to their communities, that reintegration part of DDR, they're rejected. They're shunned because they've been, quote, corrupted by this period when they were fighters. And this has happened, I've heard it from Palestinian women as well. This is a very common phenomenon. And of course we know that women are very rarely part of peace talks. Recent research, though, has shown something very interesting. When women do get into peace talks, and there are cases, when they do get into peace talks post-conflict, they bring with them women's demands. And in the peace agreements where there have been women, feminists, with women demands, in the peace talks, we find that the agreements that come out do include women's rights, do include various clauses protecting women's rights. There's a book recently by a young scholar named Miriam Anderson, a book called Windows of Opportunity, How Women Seize Peace Negotiations for Political Change. She looked at all the peace agreements that were signed between 1975 and 2011. And she found that 40% of the agreements, that is 55 out of 195 of these peace agreements that signed between 1975 and 2011, contained references to women. In other words, where women were participating in the talks, in almost all of the cases where women were participating, this amounted to about 40% of the agreements, there were clauses that referenced rights of women. I think much of this was due to 1325. Of course, it comes later in the later part of her research, but 1325 certainly did bring women, in many cases, into negotiations. And 1325, as we've heard here in the talks, 1325 was based basically or justified by three pillars. 1325 that demands women being brought into peace negotiations and issues of war and peace. The first pillar or justification is the issue of rights. Women are 50% of the population. Democracy, rights, demands our participation. The second justification is that women are affected, we are victims of war. And the third justification is that women bring something different to the table. In some cases, people mean the motherhood motif. In some cases, just that women are more peaceful, which was the old argument, if women get the vote, we're going to be more peaceful, we're going to understand the moral side of things. And many feminists reject this third justification. I reject it in part because we're not all mothers, obviously, and I think that it's an essentialist definition to say that we're going to bring peace to the negotiations. But it is true that we do bring something different. I think that women, no matter what class, and if we look at the class or women in a group, in an ethnic group, wherever women are, our experience is different from that of men in that same category. Our daily experience is different. And in that sense, we do bring something different to peace talks if we get in them. But is it, of course, something connected with peace? Are we indeed more peaceful? And we've already heard some talks about women perpetrators, and we know that there are plenty of women perpetrators out there, not just in national liberation movements, but even amongst the suffragettes. As I mentioned earlier, there were arguments over using violence or not using violence. And if we look at Rwanda, for example, or Burma, we have women perpetrators, plain and simple. So this essentialist argument of women and peace is questionable. Moreover, I think that militarism, and a militaristic society often breeds militaristic women. And here I have to bring my own example. Israel is a militaristic society. It's a society engaged in prolonged armed conflict. And so feminists have had to tackle this issue, to address this issue of militarism and the role of women in a militaristic society. And here I want to explain, although I think it's probably clear, a society that's in conflict, prolonged armed conflict, views the military, almost by definition, as a central institution. Certainly in Israel, the military was, and to some degree still is, a central institution. It's there in the bringing up, the giving birth to a male child, because you know that child is going to go on and be a fighter. But it's more than that. The way society looks at that male child is that he will grow up to be the protector. He's going to have a very special role in society and maybe actually sacrifice his life. And that gives men boys growing up a certain sense of entitlement, beyond the usual sense of entitlement that I think men experience. But not only that, in a society in conflict, it's usually the case, and certainly in our case, that almost everybody goes to the army, men and women alike. And the army is in many ways the last stage of socialization for young adults. They go to the army at the age of 18. And so if this central institution through which most young people move for 2 or 3 years of their lives, if there is not equality within this institution, we felt, there will not be equality outside. If, when they go through this last socialization experience, if there isn't equality there between men and women, including, by the way, women's role in combat, we're not going to have equality in society. And this is how we looked at it, feminists in Israel. We saw, and I can give you my personal experience. I was in the army as a volunteer. I was in the Six-Day War. Later, I did reserve duty for 3 years as an advisor on the status of women to the what's called the Israel Defense Forces, the Israeli Army. And I argued and worked very hard to have equality in the military, to have women in combat. But research then showed us something very interesting. Serving in the army did not bring equality. Serving in combat has not brought women equality, just as it didn't help those women in the Algerian War of National Liberation. Actually, something else happened. The women, and I'm talking today, the women adapted, women in combat, women in the military, given equal roles, equal units, equal gender mixed units and so forth. The women adapted to male life. They adopted the male attitudes, including the male attitudes towards women, where in the army, if you're weak, you're called a woman. And women adopted this. They would lower their voice when they spoke. They would sort of lower their pants. They adopted the male norms in the army and the male way of thinking, so to speak. They adopted male behavior. In a sense, it's like what happens to women in politics. Many women in politics adapt. It's the only way to be successful. And the theory is that if we have a critical mass in politics, we can change the way politics are conducted. That hasn't been proven yet, even in countries that have a critical mass, but never mind, that's the theory. But then there's a question, can that happen in the army? Is that possible in the army? There are cases where women going into police forces have been known to soften the way in which the police go about their business. But I question, I have no answer. Can that be done in an army? Does an army need hierarchy and commands and aggressiveness? Can an army be different? Or do women have to adapt? Our experience so far, and we do have experience, women in the army, women serving in the army, women serving in combat, does not lead to equality. It does not lead to greater value or status for the women, but rather women are accepting and adjusting to the structure of the military, the patriarchal structure of the military and its norms. And I want to add another element, perhaps very specific to societies in conflict. And that's a question of nonviolence. And I don't mean necessarily pacifism, because pacifism is often defined as opposing the use of violence in any circumstances, including defense or self-defense. I'm not sure that that's exactly the same thing, pacifism and using nonviolence. But just the way the suffragettes, as I mentioned earlier, differed amongst themselves over the use of violence, and so too national liberation movements have definitely had their differences, is what is the best tactic? Is violence, armed struggle, or nonviolence? And if you're on the occupier side, the stronger side, as I must admit I am, we are, so to speak, then the argument really is very similar for men and women. If I look at our struggle again, of the Israeli-Arab struggle, specifically Israel-Palestinian struggle, we have it's an argument amongst men as well as women. Although there is a very small feminist organization against militarism. Their whole position is against any sign of militarism in society, and so they advocate refusal to serve altogether, to resist the draft. I'm in a peace organization that is joint Israelis and Palestinians. What makes it special are two things, and they're combined, and that is that we're not only Palestinians and Israelis, we're Palestinians and Israelis who were former combatants. It's called Combatants for Peace. The Palestinians were terrorists. The Palestinians, for the most part, including women, were in Israeli jails for having carried out or tried to carry out terrorist attacks. The men, the Israelis, were in combat. Well, certainly almost everybody, including the women, were in the army, and many were combat officers. And what was common and what led to the creation of this peace organization was a personal transformation on the part of each person to abandon the use of violence and to advocate nonviolent struggle in the midst of the conflict. This is the only organization in the world where combatants from both sides, while the conflict is going on, have abandoned the use of force and advocate nonviolence. I had a Palestinian colleague, woman, explain it to me once, how she became a peace activist, which was really very interesting. She was in the Palestinian National Liberation Movement. She was head of the Palestinian Communist Party's women's department, or women's section. She was a feminist and a peace activist working not in this organization I mentioned, but an earlier one that I helped create of Israeli and Palestinian women for peace, using nonviolence, of course. And she said that she came to this, as communist, a feminist, she came to this because of haram, which didn't exactly explain things to me, until she told me haram means, in Arabic, it means forbidden. And she said, when I was a girl growing up, everything was haram, haram, haram. Everything was forbidden. Everything was forbidden to her as a Muslim girl growing up in a generally Muslim society. Everything was forbidden. And so she basically rebelled. She rebelled against her place in that society, the place in the family, her role in Palestinian society. And here I saw something similar to an analysis I had read of Rosa Luxemburg, maybe even Emma Goldman, who had, according to one analysis anyway, who had rebelled against their Jewish family and community, the authoritarianism and the restrictive surroundings in which they had grown up. But I don't think that we're talking about simple rebellion, not in the case of my friend Amal, the Palestinian, nor in the case of Rosa Luxemburg or Emma Goldman. Rather, I think their rebellion came from something that is very much like the very source of feminism, even if Rosa Luxemburg and Emma Goldman did not call themselves feminists. But why do I say that this resembles the very source of feminism? And here I want to take a page from the Quakers. The early Quaker feminists, like Jane Addams, who was the founder of the Women's Peace Party, the early Quakers spoke about, the Quaker movement spoke of some kind of original situation, a sort of a beginning state of mankind that was a situation of equality and harmony. It was broken, this harmony and equality were broken by an usurpation of power by some over others. And from this usurpation of power came all forms of oppression, according to the Quakers, all forms of oppression and violence, slavery, male domination over women, and war. Now, I don't necessarily, I'm not religious, I don't necessarily ascribe to this original Garden of Eden of equality and harmony, but what does come out of this view is the concept or the idea of power relations. And that's the basic principle, of course, of feminism. An awareness, a consciousness of power relations within the family, within society, between nations, between genders. And as women, we experience power relations every single day. This is part of our experience, our life experience every day. And in theory, and I say in theory, this can lead us to a greater appreciation of oppression between classes, ethnic groups, countries, not necessarily, of course, but it can take us a step further to pacifism. And here, I think that the important point is that I don't necessarily see a link between women and peace or pacifism, or women or peace and women's rights. But I do see a link between feminism and peace because of this appreciation of power relations and an understanding of oppression, wherever it is, whatever it is. Today, this is called intersectionality. And I think that this is basically what we have if I return to Rosa Luxemburg, our early woman revolutionary, she demanded women's emancipation, which, like radical feminists today, she saw as economic independence in the family. But she went on to point out that subjugation of women is part of the oppression of nations. Social inequality and domination is the plight of women and nations. And for her, it was a struggle, of course, of a Marxist revolution. But for me, the point was, and for my Palestinian friend, it's a matter of understanding power relations. And that's, as I say, feminism. Indeed, early feminism, in many places, grew out of broad social movements, revolutionary social movements. Struggles for human rights against oppression gave birth to feminism. Abolition of slavery in the United States led to the early feminist movement. In the 20th century, it was the civil rights movement that led to women's liberation. And in both cases, these were anti-war movements, an opposition to oppression of any kind, any group, any person, what, as I said, we call today intersectionality. It's all about power relations. And so I will repeat that for me, it's not a question of women being peaceful or pacifist and a direct connection necessarily between peace and women's rights. But I definitely see a connection between feminism and peace. Thank you.